You are Edward II, and in the stone chamber of Berkeley Castle, this September night in 1327, you hear footsteps approaching. You've survived assassination attempts, starvation, and psychological torture. But what's about to happen will make those seem merciful. The men entering your cell carry a red-hot iron rod, and they know exactly where to insert it. The cold seeps through the damp walls as you press yourself against the corner. Your breath comes in shallow gasps, fog in the torchlight. Thomas Berkeley and John Maltravers stand in the doorway, their faces blank masks that reveal nothing. Behind them, two more men carry something wrapped in cloth, steam rising from whatever burns inside. The smell of heated metal fills your nostrils, acrid and sharp. This moment didn't begin tonight. It began 27 years ago, when you first met a young Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston, and your obsession with him set in motion a chain of events that would destroy a kingdom and end with you screaming in this cell while men hold you down and thrust fire into your body. The weapon they chose wasn't random. It was designed to punish you for the very thing that brought you here. Think medieval England was all about chivalry and honor? Think again. What you're about to discover is how the intimate preferences of one king triggered a civil war, multiple executions, and ultimately one of the most symbolically brutal murders in recorded history. The establishment didn't just kill Edward II, they made his death a message about what happens when desire overrides duty. Edward of Caernarvon became king in 1307 at age 23, ascending to rule England, Wales, and significant territories in France. But the crown he inherited was already compromised by a relationship that had begun years earlier, one that would define and destroy his reign. In 1300, while still Prince of Wales, Edward met Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight in his father's household. What started as friendship transformed into an obsession so complete that contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe it without violating church doctrine. The Vita Edwardi Secundi, a contemporary biography written by a monk who witnessed court events, describes how Edward lavished Gaveston with titles, lands, and affection that went far beyond normal royal favor. The prince gave Gaveston jewels from the royal treasury, shared his bed openly at court, and called him Brother Piers in front of nobles who seethed with rage. Edward I, the formidable warrior king, recognized the danger immediately. In his final months, the dying king ordered Gaveston exiled from England, making his son swear an oath to keep the Gascon away forever. Edward II broke that promise within weeks of his father's death. His first act as king in July 1307 was recalling Gaveston from exile and showering him with unprecedented honors. He made Gaveston Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for royal blood. He gave him control of key castles, vast estates, and authority that eclipsed seasoned nobles who had served the crown for generations. But the gifts were nothing compared to the public displays of affection that scandalized the court. In January 1308, Edward married Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV, in a ceremony designed to cement the alliance between England and France. The 12-year-old princess arrived in England expecting a traditional royal wedding. Instead, she discovered her new husband cared more about Gaveston than his bride. Contemporary accounts describe how Edward spent the wedding feast sitting with Gaveston, ignoring Isabella completely. The jewels meant as wedding gifts for the French princess went instead to the Gascon favorite. Edward placed Gaveston in the position of honor at the ceremony, above Isabella's own uncles who had traveled from France. The humiliation of the child bride became a diplomatic crisis. Isabella's father and uncles returned to France, describing scenes that suggested Edward's relationship with Gaveston went far beyond friendship. The monk chronicling events in the Vita Edwardi Secundi wrote that Edward loved Gaveston beyond measure, using language that contemporary readers understood as describing an intimate bond. Froissart's Chronicles, compiled from eyewitness accounts, stated plainly that the king was too much in love with Piers Gaveston, making gifts and creating such closeness that caused amazement throughout the realm. The English barons had tolerated favoritism before, but Edward's obsession with Gaveston crossed every boundary of acceptable royal behavior. The king elevated his favorite above men whose families had served the crown for centuries. Gaveston's arrogance made things worse. He mocked the great nobles with nicknames that stung precisely because they came from a foreign upstart. He called the Earl of Lancaster the Fiddler, the Earl of Warwick the Black Dog, and the Earl of Pembroke Joseph the Jew. These weren't playful jests among friends. They were calculated insults from someone who knew the king would protect him from consequences. By 1308, the barons demanded Gaveston's exile. The ordinances drawn up by the Lords Ordainers explicitly named Gaveston as a corrupt influence who must be removed from the kingdom. Edward, facing potential civil war, agreed to send his favorite away. Gaveston went to Ireland as the king's lieutenant, a comfortable exile with full royal authority. But Edward couldn't bear the separation. Within months, he brought Gaveston back, defying the barons and Parliament. The pattern repeated. Exile, return, exile, return. Each time, Edward's defiance grew bolder, his gifts more lavish, his public affection more scandalous. In 1311, the barons forced through new ordinances that limited royal power and explicitly banned Gaveston from England forever. Edward signed under duress, then immediately began plotting his favorite's return. By early 1312, Gaveston was back at Edward's side, and the kingdom descended into open conflict. Thomas of Lancaster, the king's own cousin, and the most powerful baron in England, had reached his limit. If Edward wouldn't enforce the ordinances, Lancaster would do it himself. The hunt for Gaveston began in May 1312. Edward and his favorite fled north, seeking refuge in Scarborough Castle on the Yorkshire coast. The fortress, perched on cliffs above the sea, should have been impregnable. But Lancaster's forces laid siege, and Gaveston's supplies ran low. On May 19th, facing starvation, Gaveston negotiated surrender to Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke. Pembroke swore an oath that Gaveston would receive safe conduct to negotiate with the king. Pembroke kept his word for exactly 9 days. On the night of June 9th, while Pembroke slept at a nearby manor, Guy de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, the man Gaveston had mockingly called the Black Dog, arrived with armed men. They seized Gaveston from Pembroke's custody and dragged him to Warwick Castle. There, Lancaster and the other barons held a brief trial without the king present. The verdict was predetermined. On June 19, 1312, they took Gaveston to Blacklow Hill, land belonging to Lancaster. 2 Welshmen ran him through with swords, then beheaded him. They left his body on the hill, denying it Christian burial. News of Gaveston's execution reached Edward while he was campaigning in the north. The king's grief shocked even those who understood his obsession. Edward collapsed, refusing food and drink for days. When he finally emerged from his chambers, his rage was absolute. But more telling was what he did with Gaveston's body. For more than 2 years, Edward refused to allow burial. He had the corpse embalmed and kept it in a Dominican friary, visiting regularly to mourn beside the preserved remains of his beloved favorite. The Lanercost Chronicle describes how the king wept over Gaveston's body, touching the cold flesh and speaking to him as though he could still hear. The kingdom you've just witnessed descending into chaos over forbidden intimacy stands at the brink of something far worse. What comes next will show you that Edward learned nothing from Gaveston's death except that he needed someone else to fill the void. If you're drawn to these buried truths about how power and desire destroy kingdoms, subscribing ensures you never miss these deep investigations into history's most guarded secrets. The patterns of obsession you're seeing will repeat with even more devastating consequences, and understanding this cycle reveals something fundamental about human nature when unchecked passion meets absolute power. What's about to unfold makes Gaveston's story look like a practice run for genuine catastrophe. Edward eventually made peace with Lancaster and the barons, but everyone knew it was temporary. The king needed someone to replace Gaveston in his affections and his bed. That someone appeared around 1318 in the person of Hugh Despenser the Younger, son of one of Edward's loyal advisors. If the king's relationship with Gaveston had scandalized the court, his obsession with Despenser would drive the kingdom to civil war and foreign invasion. Hugh Despenser was everything Gaveston had been, but more calculating and far more dangerous. Where Gaveston had been content with titles and attention, Despenser wanted power, real power. He manipulated Edward's obsession masterfully, using the king's desire to accumulate wealth and authority that eclipsed any subject in English history. Edward made Despenser royal chamberlain, giving him control of access to the king and authority over royal finances. Every petition, every request, every appointment went through Despenser. He became the gateway to royal favor, and he charged accordingly. The wealth Despenser extracted was staggering. Royal records show Edward granting him estates across England and Wales, castles, towns, and rights that should have remained with the crown. Despenser seized lands from neighboring nobles through legal manipulation, using Edward's authority to override any challenges. When Thomas of Lancaster and other barons protested, Edward ignored them completely. He was more deeply infatuated with Despenser than he had ever been with Gaveston. And this time, he refused to compromise. Isabella of France, now in her 20s and mother to 4 royal children, watched her humiliation deepen. Where she had once competed with Gaveston for Edward's attention, now she faced complete exclusion. Despenser went beyond favoritism. He actively worked to isolate and impoverish the queen. In 1324, he convinced Edward to confiscate Isabella's lands, claiming French sympathies made her a security risk. The queen's household was dismantled, her servants dismissed, her income reduced to a pittance. Despenser installed his own agents to control what remained of her establishment. Contemporary chroniclers describe how Despenser prevented Isabella from speaking privately with Edward, stationing guards outside her chambers and monitoring her correspondence. The queen's humiliation was complete and deliberate. Despenser wanted her to know exactly who controlled the king. When Isabella complained to Edward, he sided with his favorite every time. The message was clear. Despenser mattered more than the queen, more than the marriage, more than the alliance with France. By 1325, Isabella had endured 17 years of marriage to a man who preferred other men in his bed. She had given Edward 4 children, maintaining the pretense of a functioning royal marriage while watching her husband lavish affection and resources on his favorites. But Despenser's cruelty pushed her too far. When Edward needed someone to negotiate with her brother Charles I of France over disputed territories, Isabella volunteered. Edward, perhaps not recognizing the danger, agreed. In March 1325, Queen Isabella left England for France. She would not return as Edward's wife. In France, Isabella found freedom and fury in equal measure. Her brother's court welcomed her with sympathy, understanding exactly what she had suffered. There she met Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron who had escaped from the Tower of London and fled to France. Mortimer had his own grievances against Edward and Despenser. They had seized his lands and imprisoned him without trial. Now, in French exile, Mortimer and Isabella formed an alliance that was political, military, and intimate. The queen took Mortimer as her lover, a relationship she conducted openly at the French court. Isabella and Mortimer spent 18 months gathering support and resources for an invasion. Isabella's brother provided some funds, though officially France remained neutral. More money came from exiled English nobles and continental merchants who saw opportunity in regime change. By September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer had assembled a mercenary army and a fleet to transport them. On September 24th, they landed at Orwell in Suffolk with fewer than 1,500 men. It was enough. Edward's regime collapsed with stunning speed. Town after town declared for Isabella and Mortimer as they marched inland. The nobles who had endured years of Despenser's corruption and Edward's obsessive favoritism flocked to the Queen's banner. By October, Isabella controlled most of England. Edward and Despenser fled west toward Wales, hoping to find loyal forces or escape by sea. They found neither. On November 16, 1326, Royalist forces captured Despenser near Llantrisson in South Wales. Edward himself was taken prisoner shortly after at Neath Abbey. The king, who had defied barons, parliament, and his own wife for his favorites, now faced complete defeat. But Isabella and Mortimer weren't done. They wanted blood, and they wanted it to carry a message. Hugh Despenser the Younger was brought to Hereford on November 24th for execution. What happened there reveals the depth of rage against Edward's favorites and the symbolism his enemies attached to the king's intimate preferences. The execution was designed to be as public and degrading as possible. First, they stripped Despenser naked and paraded him through the town. Biblical verses condemning certain intimate acts were written on his skin. The crowd threw refuse and excrement as he passed. The execution itself combined all the elements of hanging, drawing, and quartering with additional refinements. They hanged Despenser until nearly dead, then cut him down while still conscious. The executioner castrated him first, throwing his severed parts into a fire while Despenser watched. Contemporary accounts from London chronicles describe how the crowd cheered as the organs burned. The symbolism was deliberate. These were the parts that had corrupted the king, the physical means of Despenser's influence. Their destruction was meant to purify the kingdom. Then came the disembowelment. The executioner opened Despenser's abdomen and pulled out his intestines while he still lived, burning them as well. Only after enduring these tortures was Despenser beheaded. His body was quartered, the parts sent to different cities as warning. His head was mounted on London Bridge, where it remained for years. The brutality shocked even a medieval audience accustomed to harsh justice. But for Isabella and Mortimer, Despenser's execution was just the beginning. Edward himself remained imprisoned, first at Kenilworth Castle under the custody of Henry of Lancaster. In January 1327, Parliament met to address the crisis of a captured king. The solution they devised was unprecedented. Edward would be forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, who would become Edward III with Isabella and Mortimer as regents. On January 20th, 1327, a delegation visited Edward at Kenilworth to demand his resignation. The king initially refused, weeping and fainting when told he must give up the crown. Under threat that his son would be passed over entirely in favor of a non-royal, Edward finally agreed. The abdication solved Parliament's immediate problem, but created a new one. A living former king was dangerous, a potential rallying point for rebellion. Isabella and Mortimer couldn't simply release Edward, but keeping him at Kenilworth under Lancaster's relatively gentle custody seemed equally risky. In April 1327, they transferred Edward to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, placing him under the control of Thomas Berkeley and John Maltravers. The orders were specific. Edward must be kept secure, but his death must appear natural, without visible marks. Berkeley Castle became Edward's prison and torture chamber. The keepers began with psychological torment. They moved him repeatedly between the castle's dankest cells, denying him sleep and proper food. They forced him to watch from the walls as his remaining supporters were captured and executed in the courtyard below. They read proclamations declaring him a sodomite and a failure who had destroyed England through unnatural desires. Every cruelty was designed to break his spirit without marking his body. The physical torture escalated gradually. They denied him sanitation, forcing him to live in his own waste. They shaved his head and beard with cold water from the castle ditch, water mixed with sewage. They starved him to the point of collapse, then revived him with just enough food to continue the torment. They deprived him of light, keeping him in absolute darkness for days. Every method left no permanent external marks that would reveal foul play if the body had to be displayed. Multiple escape attempts were discovered and crushed. In July 1327, a plot to free Edward was uncovered before it could succeed. The conspirators were executed immediately, some within sight of Edward's cell. Each failed rescue attempt convinced Isabella and Mortimer that the former king had to die soon. But the death had to be orchestrated carefully. England couldn't have a martyred king. The official story had to be natural death from the melancholy and poor health that often afflicted deposed monarchs. September 21st, 1327, was chosen for practical reasons. The night was dark with no moon, the castle isolated, and arrangements had been made to announce Edward's death as sudden illness. What happened in that cell was reconstructed from multiple chronicle sources, though the exact details remain debated by historians. The Annales Paulini, written within a few years of the events, provides the most explicit account. The method was designed to kill Edward while leaving minimal external evidence. Thomas Berkeley and John Maltravers entered Edward's cell that night with two other men whose names were never recorded. They carried a heavy wooden table, a hollow cow horn, and an iron rod that had been heating in the cell's fireplace. The smell of hot metal filled the confined space. Edward, weakened by months of abuse, still fought when he understood what they intended. The chronicler describes his screams as the men forced him face down on the table, holding his arms and legs. The hollow horn was inserted first, creating a passage. Then came the red-hot iron, thrust through the horn deep into Edward's body. The method was diabolical in its precision. The internal burns would be fatal but difficult to detect on external examination. The horn prevented external burning that would prove murder. The symbolism was equally calculated. Edward would die through the very part of his body that had allegedly led him into sin. His intimate preferences, which had destroyed his relationship with his barons and his wife, would become the means of his destruction. The Annales Paulini states plainly that Edward's shrieks were heard throughout Berkeley Castle and in the town beyond its walls. People in the village, lying in their beds that September night, heard the dying king's agony and knew murder was being done. But no one intervened. No one challenged the official story that would come the next morning. The former king had died peacefully in his sleep from natural causes, grief, and the decline that often followed deposition. The body was displayed to prove the cause of death. Local dignitaries and clergy were summoned to view Edward's corpse and attest that it showed no signs of violence. The internal injuries, hidden from casual examination, supported the claim of natural death. But rumors spread immediately. The screams had been too loud, too anguished. People whispered about the method, about the deliberate symbolism. The official story convinced no one, but officially it remained unchallenged. Isabella and Mortimer ruled England for 3 years after Edward's death, governing in the name of the young Edward III. They distributed lands and titles to their supporters, enriching themselves from the royal treasury just as Despenser had done. But their hold on power was always fragile. The brutal execution of Despenser and the mysterious death of Edward II had shocked many nobles, even those who had opposed Edward's rule. The young king, growing into his power, resented his mother's control and her obvious relationship with Mortimer. In October 1330, the 17-year-old Edward III staged a coup. His men seized Mortimer at Nottingham Castle, arresting him in Isabella's presence. The queen allegedly cried out, "Have pity on gentle Mortimer," but her son showed none. Mortimer was taken to London, tried before Parliament for the murder of Edward II among other crimes, and executed at Tyburn. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, suffering the same fate he had inflicted on Hugh Despenser. His body parts were distributed across England as Despenser's had been. Isabella escaped execution, perhaps because she was Edward III's mother, perhaps because the young king couldn't bring himself to kill her. She was placed under house arrest at Castle Rising in Norfolk, where she lived for 28 more years. Contemporary accounts describe how she kept beside her bed a small casket containing Edward II's heart, preserved and embalmed. Whether this represented guilt, grief, or simply possession of a relic from her royal marriage remains unknown. She died in 1358, outliving her husband by 31 years, and was buried in her Franciscan nun's habit, requesting that Edward's heart be placed with her body. The method of Edward II's death became one of medieval history's most debated events, Some modern historians question whether the red-hot poker story is true or propaganda invented by Edward's enemies to justify the killing. Alternative theories suggest Edward escaped Berkeley Castle and lived in exile, with the displayed body belonging to someone else. A letter emerged in the 14th century claiming Edward survived and ended his days in an Italian monastery. But the overwhelming weight of evidence supports the murder story. Multiple independent chronicles describe the same method. The timing, the screams, and the convenient official explanation all point to orchestrated assassination. What makes Edward II's death particularly significant is how it crystallized medieval attitudes toward relationships between men, especially when those relationships affected political power. Medieval society understood that men could have intense emotional and physical bonds with other men. Monasteries, military orders, and noble households all provided contexts where such relationships existed. But Edward's relationships with Gaveston and Despenser crossed boundaries that threatened social order. They elevated favorites above rightful nobility, disrupted marriages and alliances, and suggested that intimate desire could override political duty. The symbolic nature of Edward's execution was meant to send a message that resonated through the kingdom and across Europe. Kings who allowed unnatural passions to corrupt their judgment would face punishment fitting their sins. The method of death became its own warning. Contemporary chroniclers didn't shy from describing it explicitly because the brutality was part of the deterrent. Future kings should see what happened when desire overwhelmed duty, when intimate preferences destroyed political wisdom. Now you understand why Edward II heard those footsteps with such terror. The men entering his cell weren't just executing a deposed king. They were enacting a ritual punishment designed to erase the corruption they believed his intimate choices had brought to England. The heated iron wasn't just a murder weapon. It was a symbol, a message, and a warning that would echo through centuries of history. You entered this story thinking you knew about medieval brutality, but what you've discovered is how the personal became political in ways that destroyed not just individuals, but entire systems of power. Edward's obsessions with Gaveston and Despenser weren't just scandals. They were challenges to the social order that governed medieval Europe, and the response showed exactly how that order defended itself. If this exploration into the intersection of power, desire, and violence has transformed your understanding of medieval history, subscribing means you'll continue accessing these revelations about what really happened behind the official stories. While others accept sanitized versions, you now know the raw truth of how kingdoms actually functioned, how justice actually worked, and how the powerful actually lived and died. The fate of Edward II stands as one of history's clearest examples of how intimate choices become weapons in political warfare. His story isn't just about a murdered king. It's about the collision between personal desire and public duty, about what happens when absolute power meets obsessive love, and about how societies punish those who violate their deepest taboos. The heated iron in that Berkeley Castle cell wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated symbolism, designed to ensure that Edward's death would teach the lesson his life had refused to learn.